As one of the first main characters Geralt meets in The Witcher 3, you could be mistaken for thinking that Keira Metz is an early game tutorial in character form, but although she holds your hand through an early quest, her character is so much more than that. So let's talk about it. Hello guys, and welcome back to another video. Today, as the title explains, we are going to be talking about Keira Metz, her character, her quests, and ultimately her fate. In this video I'm going to discuss all of these facets of her from within The Witcher 3 and explain why she is more than just a tutorial character to hold Geralt's hand through the quest Wandering in the Dark, and how she fits into the flow of the wider story and the main quest itself. With that said, let's get into it. I'd like to start by talking about what is known about Keira from the books prior to meeting her in The Witcher 3. Keira actually features a reasonable amount for a minor character in the novels. She was an advisor to King Foltest of Temeria and featured in the books Time of Content and Baptism of Fire, as well as a brief moment in Lady of the Lake. She was present at the Thanedd banquet, where her and Geralt conversed before being interrupted by another sorceress. She was also therefore present at the resulting Thanedd coup. She was part of an attempted counter-coup led by Philippa Eilhart and Sabrina Glesvig, as well as Dijkstra. This counter-coup to stop the Nilfgaard coup actually failed, and once this failure became apparent, Keira was actually thrown out of a window by another sorcerer called Arnor Terranova, and actually landed almost on top of Geralt, breaking her leg and several ribs. Geralt at the time was outside of the battle and trying to make his way in. Keira was actually very helpful to Geralt. In exchange for carrying her so that she could show him the way, she also proceeded to tell Geralt about all of the goings on and events that had just transpired within the tower. Keira eventually survived the battle and her injuries and fled to Monte Calvo Castle, one that Philippa Eilhart owned, along with Triss and Philippa herself, as Foltest, as a result of the coup, had actually exiled her, and she later joined the Lodge of Sorceresses. So with that brief summary of the background of Keira Metz out of the way, I'd like to first talk about the main quest interactions that the player will have with her.
The Wild Hunt.
What? Phantom Riders? That means... I thought they didn't exist.
Now let's actually talk about the main point of this video, the quest interactions between Keira and Geralt in The Witcher 3, starting with her supporting role in the main questline in Velen. Keira is one of two main story related characters that Geralt meets in Velen, that, if played normally, is actually in the early part of the game, although you can leave it till last if you so desire. As a result, the game in many ways uses her, as well as the other main character in this section, the Bloody Baron, in order to introduce the player to the types of quests, dialogues and interactions that Geralt will undertake in his ultimate goal to find Ciri. In some ways then, Keira Metz's character is designed to be an early representation of the rest of the game, and her character itself sets expectations for the player, particularly when it comes to the impact of choice and consequence, a theme that runs so strongly through the entire game. The main questline, however, is where Keira fills her role as an introductory character. She supports the player through the early quest of Wandering in the Dark, often the first time the player will have had to explore any ruins or cave, and so it carefully introduces them into that element, while also assisting Geralt in defeating the first difficult boss of the game in the form of Nithral, who packs a punch in the earlier game. The game also uses Keira as a vessel to provide you with key quest items that are reused throughout the rest of the game. In the main quest, this is actually the Eye of Nehelene, and is followed up should you pursue her side quests by obtaining the Magic Lamp. These both can be used in other quests to find out information later in the game. In her main quest form then, Keira is at most a supporting cast member, present to assist with the first main boss, the first exploration of Elven ruins, and a way for the game to provide Geralt with key items he will need in the future. So you might be wondering, how does she develop further then? Well, this is done through her side quests, which is what I would like to talk about next.
Keira, what are you doing?
Geralt. You gave me quite a start.
Her side quests themselves are of course optional, although some are critical for particular achievements that you can achieve within the game, as well as, arguably making Geralt and his allies' lives much easier further down the line, if done in a certain way. The questline follows immediately after Wandering in the Dark, where Keira will ask for your help to retrieve the magic lamp that the Elven Sage, who we later find out is Avalok, of course, promised to give her but never delivered. After helping her with this, she will invite you to meet her back at her hut at a later point, which Geralt can choose to do so at any time. Upon returning, she asks for a favour from you to lift the curse that is gripping Fyke Isle, the isle in the middle of the lake in the middle of Velen. She claims that this is due to requests from the local peasants, but of course, she has her own selfish motives underneath that. Following her questline through, you can eventually romance her, before the conclusion of the quest, which ultimately decides her fate, but I will come back to that in a moment. The initial side quests are actually very interesting because a first time player is unlikely to see what is actually going on until the very end. The game does quite well to mask her motives on first playthrough, but when you play through multiple times it starts to become easier to spot that she is perhaps not as genuine as she first seems. Therefore, in only a couple of side quests, Keira has developed from a tutorial character to a much more developed and nuanced one. It's perhaps the initial tutorial nature of her character that lulls players into this sort of false sense of security with her, when really all along it transpires that she is actually using you.
The fairy tale about Cinderella.
True story it's based on, too. A Zoogle cropped up in a palace pond and ate Princess Cinderella whole. Left behind one slipper, so...
I beg you, not another word about Zoogles.
With regards to romance, there is a constant flirtatiousness between Geralt and Keira throughout their quests together. Once again, this is an example of Keira's manipulation, although it initially doesn't seem that way, particularly for newer players, as previously mentioned. As a result, Geralt is able to romance Keira after the second shorter quest, Finding the Ingredients, which involves a candlelit dinner and of course later, the romance. During the dinner is one of the times players may start to see that something is up, particularly in the conversations around Keira's fortunes changing and what they are celebrating, as well as her concern over whether or not you burnt the mage's notes in the tower. This is a strong clue to all players that Keira always had other motives in mind, and that essentially she has used Geralt, potentially in more ways than one. This becomes clear very quickly after the romance ends, when she puts Geralt to sleep and he awakes, realising that she must have headed back to the tower on Fyke Isle.
Keira, where? Put me to sleep with a spell. Means she's up to something. Fyke Isle, the tower.
When you head to the tower, you find Keira there, having taken the mage's notes. You find that she is actually very frustrated with her living conditions, most notably bedbugs.
See this? Bedbugs, Geralt. Bloody bedbugs. I, Keira Metz, advisor to Foltest, a member of the Lodge of Sorceresses, have bedbugs.
And that she has effectively used you to get the notes from the tower so that she can go and bargain with Radovid for safety, in exchange for either a cure to the Catriona virus, which is what the mage was investigating, or a weapon, a biological weapon of some kind, that she can make on his behalf to help in the ongoing conflict. After this revelation, through the dialogue that Geralt has, he can make choices, and in those choices, these ultimately decide Keira's fate, and conclude her story. On the one hand, Geralt can convince Keira that going to Radovid is suicide, and instead convince her to go to Kaer Morhen, where she will be safe. Although whether or not she actually does this depends on whether or not you take the mage's notes off of her. If you do take the notes off of her, she arrives at Kaer Morhen and assists in the battle, saving Lambert's life, and eventually will leave with him to find a cure for the Catriona plague, concluding her story there. If the player, as Geralt, is so disgusted by this betrayal and how he's been used, then Geralt can himself kill Keira then and there. It is understandable that Geralt might feel betrayed by Keira, as she has effectively used him, and also be disgusted by her desire to take the notes to Radovid and make an evil biological weapon, regardless of whether Geralt himself thinks that Radovid will actually listen to her and not laugh her out the door. Obviously, killing Keira ends her story there. The final option is that Geralt can also just let Keira go without taking the notes off of her, either by convincing her to go to Kaer Morhen but leaving the notes with her, or instead not getting involved and allowing her to leave and not recommending Kaer Morhen as a destination either. In the case that you don't recommend Kaer Morhen at all, they part but not necessarily happily, as Geralt will still feel betrayed by her. Later, Geralt will find out that she tried to bargain with Radovid and convince him to give her safety in order for her to create a biological weapon for the war for him. Radovid, as expected, laughs in her face and orders her impaled in the central square in Novigrad. The body can later be recovered with Triss in quite a sad and poignant moment, as Keira and Triss were good friends, and Triss had actually attempted to convince her not to go and see Radovid at all, but to no avail.
Keira thought too much of her charm, tried to buy her way into Radovid's graces, offered to make a powerful weapon for him. I tried to talk her out of it, but she refused to listen. Radovid laughed in her face, ordered her captured, then impaled. Nothing I could do.
Part of the uniqueness of Keira is that unlike other sorceresses, she is actually quite nice to Geralt most of the time, and is quite helpful, particularly as I said in the main quest. Her presence in the early part of the game in Velen as a pseudo-tutorial is a part of what convinces players she is friendly and a safe character, but the more her questline progresses, the more it becomes clear that she has some kind of ulterior motive, as described above. This is a really interesting character development, particularly because of the impact that the player, as Geralt, has on her fate and outcome. It creates doubt over her character in the player's eyes over time before presenting the critical decision, and it also leaves a variety of outcomes. For some players, the consequences become immediately apparent, in that they kill her directly, but for others it is only shown later what the consequences are of your actions upon this character. This is really great character building from the game, and is one that creates great tension and a difficult decision so early in the game, not to mention showing the impact and importance of dialogue, as all of these decisions on her fate are taken through dialogue options and choices, and it shows how that despite what is written in the dialogue options prompts, the words actually spoken by Geralt may have severe and critical outcomes, and be interpreted by different characters in a variety of different ways, and therefore have a variety of impacts and outcomes. In this case, the life and death of a sorceress. In conclusion then, Keira Metz is a character that in the beginning feels quite one-dimensional, and is a part of the main quest to assist the player through some early trials, but actually she is much more. Keira's character is a critical example of some of the game's core themes, most notably that actions have consequences, and that dialogue is critical throughout the story. Keira then develops as a character to show the player the impact of choice, and that impact can affect the lives of those characters you encounter through The Witcher 3. Geralt is ultimately responsible, at least in part, for what happens to Keira through his choices. Between first meeting her and deciding her fate, the game develops Keira's character, ultimately masking her motives and making her more and more suspicious as time goes on, which contends with how helpful she is when Geralt first meets and interacts with her, cleverly therefore creating a very difficult decision for the player to make when the time comes, as Geralt and the player's trust can often feel a bit broken by Keira. Not to mention that dialogue options, although they read positively, can have a negative impact on how Keira interprets Geralt's words. So what options do you choose when it comes to Keira? And what do you think of Keira Metz as a character in The Witcher 3? Let me know in the comments below, I'd love to read your guys' thoughts. That concludes my video on Keira Metz's character. If you have time, please check out my previous video that's on screen now on why The Witcher 3 contracts within the game are so freaking good. With that being said, thanks once again for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. It really helps me out. And peace.